Hi everyone, we're going to get started in just a second. Just waiting for everyone to enter into the webinar. Okay, welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We are here tonight with Zephyr Teachout in conversation with Brandi Collins-Dexter about her new book, Break 'em Up. And we are really excited about that tonight. And there is a link to purchase it in the chat column. We really encourage everyone to purchase a copy. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. So you can just click on that and it'll take you to Politics and Prose's website. The second thing I'd like to let everyone know is that the latter portion of tonight's event will be devoted to your questions. And we really encourage everyone to ask a question. And the way you can do that is to click the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screens. And there you can type in your question. There's also a chat for you guys, but if you could try to keep your questions in the Q&A icon, it just makes things a little bit easier. And with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Zephyr Teachout. She is an attorney, political activist, and antitrust and corruption expert. She's a rising star on the left, and her campaign for New York Attorney General in 2018 was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, the New York Times, and others. She was also part of the team of lawyers that sued Donald Trump for allegedly violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. Her new book is called Break 'em Up, and it discusses the ubiquity of modern monopolies, which has resulted in the greatest concentration of wealth and power since the Gilded Age. She explains how monopolies are the root cause of many of the issues that today's progressives care about. They drive economic inequality, harm the planet, limit the political power of average citizens, and harm historically disenfranchised groups. Through her expert analysis on monopolies, Teachout offers a concrete path towards thwarting these enemies of working Americans and reclaiming our democracy before it's too late. Tonight, she will be in conversation with Brandi Collins-Dexter, previously the Senior Campaign Director for Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. So, Zephyr and Brandi, the screen is yours.
Oops. Hi, how are you? Hi, sorry about that. Hi, my lighting is going off, but thank you so much for doing this with me. Thank you to Politics and Prose. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about my book, and I'm especially excited to talk with, I'll fix my lighting when she's speaking. I'm especially, yeah, I'm very, thank you. I'm especially excited to be here talking to Brandi Collins-Dexter, who is a campaigner and organizer and a thinker who I really admire, who has been working at Color of Change and is now writing her first book. Is that right? Yeah. To talk about, I'm sorry. There, can you guys see me? Do I look like a goal?
We can see you.
Okay, good. To talk about, to really get into not only how to understand what's happening, but what we can do about it, and how progressives actually, I believe, really need to reorient our organizing in some pretty significant ways. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about a few themes in the book, and then we're going to get into some real conversation and then bring you all into the conversation as well. At heart, I think we're talking about monopolies, a new form of government, not a new form, but a form of government. That this is corporate government. When we talk about taking on corporate power and the threat of corporate power, even people who think they understand it and think they're anti-corporate have not been taking seriously enough in our actions and in our way of understanding the degree to which private, unaccountable companies are directly governing us by controlling all different parts of our public spaces, whether that's Amazon, Facebook, and Google, companies which have essentially taken over the public communications infrastructure, or Amazon, which has taken over so much of our marketplace and is controlling, not just participating, but controlling the marketplace. Or companies like Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, And although I use the language of big tech, I think sometimes tech gets in the way of our understanding, because the Monsanto business model is not that different than the Amazon business model. They're both about amassing control over entire systems, using that control to extract value, govern, really reduce the power, increase fear among workers and then producers. One of the goals of the book then is to say, this is a democratic crisis. Yes, we have a Trump problem, which we are certainly hearing about during the DNC convention. And yes, we have a very serious money in politics problem, which is actually related and something I've been working on for most of my career. But we can't just look at money separate from the institutions that money is collected in, and these institutions that are acting as forms of rival government to our democratic forms of government. So that's one argument. Our second related argument is that groups that have seen each other in kind of antagonistic ways, like workers and small business owners, are really going to have to come together to fight against this new form of government. And maybe the easiest way to think about that is in the Amazon fight, where you see Amazon both basically taking 30% out of every dollar sold by a seller on Amazon. So it's highway robbery if you're a small business owner trying to sell on Amazon, and abusing workers, and being union busting. And although it likes to get a lot of credit for being this great, gracious giver of $15 an hour wages, which are not livable wages, continues to be one of the worst places to work in America, and to degrade expectations for what warehouse workers can expect. And so the alliances between workers and business owners, I think, is a really important a political alliance. That's one of the goals. Relatedly, and this is the shaking the shoulders of the progressives part, many of whom I imagine are here tonight, is to say, you may think you care about this, but when is the last time that you actually marched in the street to break something up? When is the last time you actually asked a candidate for office and said, I'm not going to support this candidate in a primary because they're too in bed with big tech? When is the last time that you made this an essential part of your politics by occupying the FTC? You're in DC. The halls of the FTC are not sort of hotbeds of activism. And we used to have antitrust leagues all around the country that would be protesting against consolidations of power like this. One of the things that's really important to me is also teasing out the ways in which we think about concentrated corporate power in racially neutral terms, but it is not racially neutral. So I come from studying election law, writing about corruption, writing about voting rights. And one of the oldest tricks in the book is, if you want to wipe out Black power, you merge congressional districts or redraw the district lines such that there were 3 districts with one district represented that was likely to be represented by a Black representative, and 2 others likely to be represented by a white representative. If you merge all 3 and elect district-wide with a majority vote, they're all going to be white. This is a traditional, well understood method for suppressing Black power in the South. Well, the mergers in corporate America have played a similar role in bleaching out Black political power, Black economic power, and economic power of communities of color more broadly. So to be more precise, if you look at funeral home industry, Black publishing, Black insurance industry, Black-owned pharmacies, there has just been this wholesale destruction of Black-owned businesses. And this is before the pandemic. And right now we are talking about as much, some people are thinking as many as 50% of Black-owned businesses will be wiped out by this pandemic. And so there's a tendency to think, well, merger law, antitrust law, to sort of code it as racially neutral, but it is decidedly not racially neutral. And you're far more likely to be, when you're looking at small and medium-sized businesses, you're far more likely to have owners of color. When you're looking at the Fortune 500, it's like 4%. And when you look at control over capital, it's even smaller. So I think we have to stop looking at concentrations of power in racially neutral terms. And by the way, there's an ongoing bargain that recurs again and again in American history, a bargain that was studied and written about by Du Bois between financial interests and local white political entrepreneurs looking to leverage racial anxiety for their own power. And we see that bargain fairly recently in Google, Pfizer, and other companies backing ALEC when it was backing voter suppression and the bad voter bills in North Carolina. It's not that bargain, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit more. There's different ways to understand it, but the impact is that you start to see monopoly as a form of politics and monopoly power as white power. And I think it's really important to understand that, while understanding that there's a lot of racist and segregationist anti-monopolists in our history. So there's I think a really complicated, important history there. And then Brandi's an expert on big tech, and we may end up talking about the ways in which big tech intersects with that. So those are some of the themes in my book. So I come with the desire to take something that has been for too long treated like it's the role of the priestly economists and say, we've got to repoliticize this. We've got to put anti-monopoly front and center. We've got to take away 4 decades of intimidation that the public has around market structure. When it comes to tax policy, people don't say, well, I don't have an economics degree, so I don't think I can push for higher taxes. When you look at labor law, people don't say, well, I don't have a law degree, so I don't think I should push for $25 minimum wage. But when it comes to market structure and mergers and breaking up, there's this like deeply learned intimidation that people feel like they don't have the authority to say something's wrong. At the same time, I'm really proud to be part of a growing movement which is saying something's wrong. And I actually just did some polling with Data for Progress, which showed a majority of Americans want to break up big ag, big tech, big cable. There's another 25% that are saying, well, I don't know. And a small number who say no, but people are curious. They understand there's a problem with power. But we have to strip away the authority of economists to determine our own power over our own lives. Those are some of the themes in the book. And again, I'm excited to hear your questions and thoughts and to talk to Brandi about them.
Yeah, thank you, Zephyr. That was great. There was so much of that you said that resonated with me. I think personally for me, having kind of dipped a toe in a trust concentration work, I have found it really sort of inaccessible. I think, for a lot of Black people, and certainly the people I work with and engage with, we get the idea of power and corporate concentration and what it means, redistricting and what it means when there's only one company in town that sets prices, or when Black businesses are shutting down all around you, but not necessarily like, okay, so what are the structural interventions? What does it mean to engage with the FTC, or how do all of these things go together? And so one thing that I really appreciated about your book was how visceral the examples and anecdotes you got into were. You talked about like suicide rates with farmers and taxi drivers. You talked about 24-year-olds with $0 in their savings. It was like example after example of really tangible impacts and where those gaps were coming from. So I'm curious, even just from a book development standpoint for you, like, what was that process? What were your goals? Like, how did you think about like which anecdotes and even the way to order the book? If you could say a little bit about that.
Well, I spent so much time trying to think about this, try to find a way to connect monopoly and power to people's lives. And because people intuitively get it, that there's too much power, as you say. But I think, like with anything in politics, you need to tell stories. And so the first chapter was really where the book started, which is a chapter, it's called Chickenization. And it's an idea that I took from a great book by Chris Leonard, who's a great investigative reporter who went deep into the chicken industry. And the phrase chickenization is a phrase from other industries that are copying the chicken industry. But I love the phrase because it's like, it's both about like chickenization, of course, is a form of fear. It's like we are getting chickenized, our society is getting chickenized. And there's all of these weird pockets of fear in places you wouldn't expect it. Increasingly, people are really afraid of political repercussions at work, for instance. And I wanted to show the way in which there's basically one growing business model. And maybe you think of it as feudal, or maybe you think of it as the mob. I like try different ways to describe it. But their one growing business model is, I'm going to get a choke point, and with chicken farmers, it's Tyson. With Amazon, it's Amazon. With Uber, it's Uber. And I'm going to use that choke point to experiment on and extract value and extract information from people who are creating value. And I think people just in like, I'm relatively new, I'm mom of a toddler, and you read stories about farming, and even people who aren't farming sort of have an imagination of what a farmer is. It's like as concrete as you get. The first, so many children's books are about like, chickens and geese. So I didn't start with children's books, but I'm thinking about that a lot now. But the way in which, like, whose job, it's so hard to imagine people's job. Whose job do we think we understand? And we think we understand what a farmer's job is. And then it turns out that a farmer's job is not independent. They're terrified. The suicide rate is really high. There's debilitating anger at these companies that are controlling the farmers. They don't know when they're being experimented on. They can't talk to their neighbors. Their contracts are all in arbitration. Well, that's exactly what is happening to the Uber drivers that I talked to in New York City. Like the exact same depression, fear, anxiety, being controlled by this central power. And I wanted to show the ways in which people who do not necessarily see themselves as aligned are having similar experiences of, honestly, it's of rational paranoia. And where, like, you're not wrong to be paranoid, and that paranoia has huge impacts on our politics, and really dangerous ones. So that's where I started. And then once you have that framework, my hope is you say, oh, I see that in these other industries. I mean, right now in the pandemic, I write about this a little, but it's getting so much worse. In the pandemic, restaurants are getting chickenized.
Right.
And there is some pushback against it, but like these platforms are standing in this position to look into all the restaurants, find out exactly all the data, suck out as much value as they can. And basically, the other thing that I care about a lot is, while we're fighting for basic, decent, a minimum wage of 15, which is still way too low, we just have to be so careful that we don't let the minimum wage become the maximum wage. Because once you have this choke point power, these companies have the power to say, like, we're going to take all the value until you basically all are getting just barely enough to get by. And the more paranoid we keep you, the less likely you are, and unstable we keep you, the less likely you are to organize, to speak up.
Yeah, no, I definitely got that. Side note, if you do ever write a children's book about corporate power, please do that, because I'm going to give that to every one of my, like,
oh, that's a good idea.
So, like, get on top of that. But I think, and again, like when you talk about these platforms and how much power they have, and so clear how, you know, the different spaces that they occupy in our lives is like seller and buyer and platform. You know, one of the analogies that you give is around particularly Silicon Valley and a certain player as the mafia, which really resonated with me. And you talked about the first Mark Zuckerberg hearing, and you draw this comparison to Frank Castellano and the mafia hearings, with, you know, Zuckerberg being given more deference, but this like moment in time where we're all looking and we're expecting, you know, something. And then you pan that out and you talk about how Facebook and Silicon Valley operates like the mafia. Can you say a little more, explain yourself on that? Because that's kind of a spicy.
Yeah, I want to talk about it, but then I have a question for you too.
Okay.
So I was trying to figure out, like, how do we make this form of oligarchy real to Americans? Like, what are forms of oligarchy that we understand, where there's private power? And I think sometimes, like when we look at, people get hung up on the word mono and monopoly, like it needs to be one. It doesn't need to be one. When Standard Oil was broken up, it had 65% of the market. It just needs to be able to set the terms. But I was thinking about, like, I argue that Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, they all coexist with formal government. So it's not like the mafia comes in and gets rid of the city, of the mayor, or gets rid of the congressman. They coexist with them, and they have their spheres, and they each recognize their spheres. And what else do they do? Well, first of all, they make sure they have close ties. And like when you look at the revolving door, which I also think is too anodyne a phrase for this enmeshed network. It's not a revolving door, it's a network of power of people who are in and out of government as a matter of social and political and economic, building a social, political, economic and mesh structure. Like all those big tech companies are doing that in a massive way. They also have law breaking built into a lot of their business model. I mean, that's sort of obvious in Uber, but even in the protections, the like huge, vast protections from liability that we gave them in 1996, when we're like, we're not going to hold you to our basic tort laws so that we can develop the internet. So breaking the law, unlike other companies, is basic to their business model. And then also when you start looking at the ways in which they threaten anybody who's going to come on their turf. They fight with each other in certain areas, like who's going to dominate the personal assistance. But in other areas, they're really protecting each other's back and making sure that the system gets maintained. And then like something like Amazon, I mean, we now know that because Bezos admitted it at this amazing hearing a couple of weeks ago, that in order to get good treatment on Amazon Marketplace, it helps if you also use Amazon's fulfillment services. So there's this like, you gotta help over here if you're gonna get help here. And it actually gets worse with Amazon because so many sellers get kicked off. So then Amazon provides services to protect sellers from themselves, which is like classic mob behavior. But you have spent a lot of time organizing against big tech, and in recent years really focused on Facebook. And I know you wanted to talk about the mob, so I want to talk about your, like, how you see, how you think about what Facebook is, and why the mob resonated with you. And then I have a follow-up question about
Yeah, so I mean, I think the mob kind of resonated with me because when I was younger, for whatever reason, I was sort of obsessed with mafia history, to be honest. And like, I think when you talk about that story of, I mean, I would say it's a little bit different from a narrative standpoint, because when you talk about the mafia or the American gangster or whatever, there's this kind of story of an immigrant or a marginalized community, like, you know, building power through a way that's like not through like sort of circumventing some of the normal rules that have kept people out of power, and then building our own system. So it's almost like romanticized in this way if you ignore all the like bodies and blood and really awful stuff about it. But like with Silicon Valley, it's in to a certain extent almost the opposite, in that you have people that come from like dominant class, dominant space, have the luxury of having this romantic story of being the kid that like drops out of college and wears a hoodie and builds a business up for nothing, where like we see what happens, you know, to Black kids that wear hoodies in our communities or dropped out of college, and how, you know, the pathologizing that goes on around that. But this idea of building this like untouchable power structure with this like kind of like Black hand, as they call it in mafia, that oversees everything, that did definitely resonate with me, with Facebook, certainly with, you know, Amazon and Google. And I think, you know, part of the work that we've been doing is really pulling back the curtain at all the different layers of power that are exerted over people's lives in visible and invisible ways. Whether it's this like false idea, this notion that Facebook is this like gatekeeper that's ensuring free speech for everybody and pulling back the layer on that. Well, it's not true. You know, Black people are more likely to be censored on the platform. You know, our news and, you know, different people's news and content is more likely to be buried unless they're willing to, you know, pay the Black hand the cost of it. There's like all of these ways in which the myth making of Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley celebrity CEO doesn't line up to the everyday experiences of people, what it means to be a business owner that has to pay so much just to get your business seen, you know, on Facebook. And then you have Amazon move into town in all of these different ways and put, you know, your business out of business or extract more of a toll on you. Then Google buries your ad in different ways. And just this like journey that people go on. You mentioned, I'll say this and I'll close, but you mentioned the businesses like Color of Change and Unidos actually partnered up and commissioned a study at the beginning of COVID, looking at Black and Latinx owned businesses and found that and saw that data that only half of them said they could make it like 6 more months. And that was, I don't know, 4 months plus ago at this point. And when you see, and also you made this point in the beginning around the tension between like workers and small business owners. But interestingly enough, in a lot of communities of color and Black communities, it's more of a partnership because those businesses are serving a function in the community. They're hiring people that wouldn't get hired in other places. Those are the spaces that we go in and organize. There's a long history of Black organizing, which you talk about in the book, in physical business spaces. And so you see that, you see those businesses going under from COVID. You see what we already lost in the 2008 recession. And then you add on top of that, the ways in which these tech companies have built this like whole economic layer that doesn't require them to actually put anything into the community, actually, you know, hire working class people. They take advantage of all sorts of tax loopholes through data centers, headquarters, and other things, and are like pushing us underground. And so that need to organize and fight back against that using every tool at our disposal. That's kind of how I came to antitrust, because to me, it was just another tool in the shed to try to slay the kind of like tech overlord, so to speak.
Yeah, awesome. So, I mean, I just want to ask you the question that I always get asked, and is, once you talk about breaking up, take Facebook, like you and I know the ways in which Facebook can be broken up once we get technical, but the immediate response is people respond by saying, this is something I need. Right? It's something, and I have a chapter that where I like really fight with ethical consumerism. It's actually called No, You Don't Need to Boycott Facebook. Although it does credit the importance of some strategic boycotts, that I do think that like in the real world, people need Facebook. Facebook and Instagram and that network has become essential for businesses, has become essential for people finding jobs, for people checking in on their grandmother, for people's social community. And so when you talk about breaking it up, it feels like that thing will then vanish and go away. But we have to break at the root of their power. And I'm just interested in, I know you're a obviously you're a big anti-monopolist. So I have 2 separate questions. One, with the demands, the color of change demands, and the more broad stop hate for profit demands, I thought they were too small, to be honest. That they were too much saying like Zuckerberg, be a better king to us, and not change the entire business model. You're breaking basic norms. And by the way, we're going to Congress. Like, why was the target? And I ended up thinking it did a really good job. And for those who don't know, Stop Hate for Profit was amazing. Is an amazing, very successful boycott campaign. I don't see it really affecting Zuckerberg's bottom line. You can fight me on that. But I do worry that boycott campaigns end up building into the idea that we should be begging Zuckerberg for favors to like be a better, kinder ruler, instead of like calling Chuck Schumer, who has had people protest outside his office, but not on these issues. So
yeah.
First question.
Yeah.
I've been sort of waiting for this. I've been dying to talk.
I know. You're like no holds barred. Like, I mean, I think so. I get asked this question in nice ways and not so nice ways a lot. And I think for me, part of the answer lies in Color of Change's history as an organization that operates as when we say by any means necessary, that means like, all the tools at our disposal. And so like we were born in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, 15 years ago, with this idea that we needed new level corporate and government accountability, that we needed media accountability. And part of that had to take multiple forms of understanding what power looks like, how to take power, how to challenge power, and what do our communities need today, and how do we play for the long game. I think, if I may be honest, I think where a lot of different organizations fail is that they stick too close to like one thing or the other. It's like they're only negotiating with corporations as if one day Mark Zuckerberg's gonna wake up and be like, oh right, no, this whole trying to be Augustus Prince Joffrey thing, like, no, it's about the people. And so they keep leaning into that power and asking power, knowing that power concedes nothing, right? We know that there are pressure points, particularly when you look at Silicon Valley and you look at the fact that we could name most of the CEOs of big tech in a way that we couldn't name the CEO of Comcast or other places. And what that means is they have a brand sensitivity that you can hit at. So you can move them a little bit in terms of alleviating immediate pressure for people. But if you stick to the negotiating table and you don't move out to local, to state, to Congress, if you don't work the media, if you don't work all the different angles, you can't create that culture shift that's necessary. To me, the political change is almost just the inevitability of a cultural shift that they have to respond to. Now, that said, I do think that like the demands on that, we were part of a coalition. Being part of a coalition means aligning around certain demands that maybe wouldn't have necessarily always been Color of Change's demands on their own, any more than like the demands we would make would be like, some of our partners in that space. But what that moment to me was a clear-cut demonstration of power and like what happens when antitrust breaks down and corporate concentration allowed to rule the day. When you can go to people and you can say, for the month of July, we got billions of dollars taken from Zuckerberg's pocket. We got every major corporation you can imagine in the US. We built a global thing. We had, the Duke and Duchess of, out here, pushing this issue, and Facebook didn't blink an eye.
That's the proof.
What are you
That's the proof, right? Yes.
What are you going to do?
But you need to go through that to prove it.
To me, but I want to kick this question back to you though, because I think one of the things that you do a really good job in your book, particularly when you're talking about that first Zuckerberg hearing, is really laying out the ways in which government has been asleep at the wheel for a really long time and almost don't even know how to respond to this new tech barren power. And even though we've seen some shifts, the hearings a couple weeks ago were beautiful. My question to you is like, what makes you think, or when you talk about money in politics, when you talk about all of these barriers, what is it that makes you think that government is definitely the key and that we could get government to act in the way that we need to?
Well, those are two different questions.
Fair enough.
I guess it's that. So I think, I, despite my criticisms of the demands, I do feel like I eat my hat a little bit on the boycott because I do think it did an amazing job, illustrating the point, and also just revealing. Like one of the powerful parts of the boycott was that it revealed to so many people how the business model is the problem, how Zuckerberg doesn't just, Facebook doesn't just allow in some neutral way white nationalist posts, but is actively promoting hate and actually making money off hate. It's like as if you're public libraries' business model was targeted ads, you would see constant fights breaking out, just horrific stuff up front, the same kind of stuff that we see up front in Facebook. That just, it was a helpful revelatory moment. I do think that the shift at the end, where you guys like then focus on Congress, was really was an amazing power move, because it was like, okay, we've made our demands, you've totally failed, you've met with us, and this is a joke. And therefore, the proof is we need to move here. The problem is our society is so embedded in the idea that if we don't try getting Comcast to act nicely first, we don't have standing to go to Congress. Like that we've just bought into a neoliberal vision that we have a job to like boycott before we act. And I see that all the time. You see that in all the hypocrisy discourse around the Green New Deal and climate change. Like she drives a car, and yet she, wants to change the way that we wants to have all renewable energy. But the hypocrisy discourse is really deep, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people on the left buy into it. It has huge class implications and race implications, like who can check out, who has the capacity to check out and feel like, oh, feel good about themselves. And actually, there's evidence that people who, one of the things I liked about your boycott is that it focused on companies and not individuals. There's evidence that people who engage in ethical consumption are actually less likely to engage in political activism, because they're like, I've done my good deed, I bought the right toothpaste. Yeah. Instead of like, okay, so you're not buying from Amazon, workers are still getting fired for being political activists. So I guess my ambition is big, but I just want to change that sequence. And I'm begging everybody to not buy into that idea that you first have to, like, your first sequence should be first call Chuck, then boycott on a personal level. And I believe in the public. I believe in public government. It's not worked too well in this country, and it's been getting worse over recent years. I don't think it's an accident that, I don't think it's an accident that corporate concentration and anti-civil rights movement came together, that agenda in Reagan, to sort of crush what I think was like the nascent democracy of the late 70s, where we had some of the time of greatest economic equality. I don't think that's an accident that those two came together. And I don't think it's easy, but the alternative is to accept our corporate overlords. I just feel like the left has gotten way too embedded in accountability campaigns. So I give Color of Change and the whole campaign a lot of credit for the multiple layers on which it moved. But I think that that we must demand. We aren't even asking our lawmakers to do anything about it. It's like we haven't been asking. We've been asking on the Green New Deal, but we're not really asking on corporate power. And we're just and I think we at least have to start asking. And there is this like things are happening. There's definitely interesting movement right now. So I do think it's possible, but like you were describing, it's not going to happen because a few inspired Congress members decide it's going to happen. It's going to happen because it comes from the bottom up. Like there is just way too much corporate power in Washington for it to happen, no matter how good the arguments are, without grassroots activism. That's what I believe.
Yeah, I definitely want to speak on that. And then I want to get to the questions, because I know we have some different questions. And if folks have more, they should add them. But I have to say, I do take your point. I was kind of resisting the urge to make a joke that's like, okay, call Chuck, don't call Chuck's daughter who works at Facebook. But like, I do think that it is, I think this idea of what it means to actually move these fights on a local, state, and federal level are so extremely important. And one of the things that I want to give like you credit for, I've talked about this before we got on, I was talking about Barry Lynn, who was one of the first people that I met, Stoller, Sarah Miller, there's other people, but like there were people when I came into the space, there's a lot I still don't know, but there were people that actually sat down and talked to me about this stuff. And it's really hard. And when you get into some of these spaces and you're talking to folks about antitrust, it almost feels like it becomes this competition to prove like who's the smartest in the room. And then the conversation gets less and less accessible. And then I sit there thinking, I know I'm a smart person, but like when you start throwing out numbers and codes and I don't know what you're talking about. So I feel like there's work that the left and progressive and racial justice movements need to do to like knock down the door in these spaces. And I think there's also an onus on some of the gatekeepers of that space to also think about like, how are you actually building a racial justice lens, not just as like some funk dust after the fact, but like really, how are we thinking about these strategies in a powerful way? And then when you see the people like the Cory Bushes and the other ones that are coming in the door and bringing this really tight analysis, I think that is inspiring more and more folks to come in. But I do want to, I know we have some questions, so I want to get to those. So Zephyr,
because I have to give credit to my new favorite Congress member, Jabal Bowman, who I haven't talked about education, but one of the things you see is big tech governing our public schools, and the pandemic makes this so much scarier. But to be Congressman Bowman has been leading the charge in New York on Gates and other big tech takeover of schools. And I think the key thing is not there. You're absolutely right. The language of antitrust left and right is like this percent and that percent. And is basically, it's a kind of baseball-y insider language. But the truth is that people get it, that there's a huge problem when Google controls, when we so rely on Google for education tools, that when it turns out that YouTube, owned by Google, has been violating kids' privacy and illegally advertising to them, school systems can't pull out because they're so dependent. Like this is a bad actor when it comes to kids. Anyway, I'm very excited to see the education lens that he brings to anti-monopoly in Congress.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. And also I want to give a shout out to, all the folks were amazing on this antitrust subcommittee, but like seeing Representative Jayapal and Representative McBath in particular, like seeing women of color just up there, just like running the thing, kind of made my heart pitter patter, but everybody was great. But Zephyr, when are you running for office again? Is the first question.
I'm not planning on it.
Okay.
I know you're supposed to keep tension out there, but I feel like we're talking about networks of power, and I am really excited to be part of the network of growing new progressives in power. And I'm super proud of my campaigns, but right now I'm focused on, in New York State, helping amazing people who are changing policy in New York as we speak, and helping a little on the federal level, especially when it comes to this kind of work. And the more porous we make activism and running for office, the better. And I'm so happy to be on the activist side.
Yeah, I love you on the activist side. Next question. Is this like, from Alistair Brown, is this exactly like Teddy Roosevelt ordering the breakup of Standard Oil back in the early 1900s? Afterwards, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, only to be repealed under Reagan. Should we run it back?
Teddy Roosevelt gets a little too much credit sometimes, a lot of times. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, although it was the first federal law, there have been, these principles are not new principles. It's not like the idea of concentrated private power occurred for the first time in the 1880s. And then when Roosevelt used it in episodic ways, that was really important, but you don't actually see serious focus on a system, not just individual cases, but a system of supporting decentralized economy in some ways and a more nationalized economy in other ways until FDR and until FDR's second term. And I think it's important not to hold up FDR's second term as perfect in any way, but there's some really exciting lessons from that. And one is that it's breaking up. I know it's called break them up, but it's not just about breaking up individual companies, although that's important. Like Google has no business owning Google Flights. Maybe that sounds like a small deal, but Google has so many, it's just a conflict of interest machine. And Amazon is this inequality machine. And Facebook is this hate machine. And they're all like running their machines. And we have to not just break them up, but turn their machines backwards. And that's what I want to take from Roosevelt's second term, is it's not enough to stop these machines, to stop the mergers, or to break up individual companies. We actually need to actively fund the fund communities that have been starved. And so like turning it around and taking the co-op model and actually having federal funding of local projects, I think is really important. This is why I love the Green New Deal, because it's like a national project, but it's funding frontline communities, entrepreneurs on the local level, small business on the local level. We have so much concentration of power that even if we break up all these companies and then just freeze it there, that alone will open up opportunities. But we actually need to, like, I think of it almost like one of those Dr. Seuss machines that we need to actually just turn around and funnel the other way. And so there's sort of a big cases model of antitrust, which I like bring big cases, and that helps discipline and helps innovation going, but it's not sufficient. I think it's got to be a lot bigger than breaking up Standard Oil. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. And I do think that's part of this issue with, I think, break them up. Like we have to, I think part of what I loved about your book, I'll say this without being a spoiler, is that in your epilogue, which I totally plan on stealing for myself, I'm saying it right now, it ends in 2040, and it paints this picture of what happens next and what's beyond if we get all the things we need, if we break them up, if we do all of these things. And to me, like that ability to have this vision of how we go further is something that I think is important to bring advocates in on it. And it's also important for us to be like working towards, but also still remaining focused on this idea of there are practical things and there's ways in which we need the FTC and Congress to act that we should be calling for.
And I guess I just want to like, maybe I'm hammering this home too much or not enough, but like what we're talking about is for me, a progressive vision of freedom.
Yeah.
And equality, and it is about like what happens to us as humans. And the other thing I want to take back from The Economist is the idea, I mean, it's why I ended up writing about suicide so much, which is just awful. Like it's not just how little people are making, it's about despair. And those are connected. It's about like disempowerment and fear are really important parts of an economic model. But the reverse of that, like when people feel something I care a lot about is people like holding in their hearts. I guess we're not on some stream where I can't swear. I grew up where my mouth was washed out with soap if I swore, so I still have that. But it's like what I talk about is like we need a fuck off economy where people hold in their hearts the knowledge that they could leave if they needed to. And even if they never leave, just knowing you could leave changes your relationship to your boss. And you real power in that relationship. And it's hugely important for unions, obviously. But I think it's also important for us as individuals, and for everybody should have that. Like that should not be just a handful of people. Everybody should have that knowledge. I could leave if I needed to.
Yeah, I feel that. Janine Hull, sorry. Isn't this basically the fundamental question of why 80% of Americans can support gun control policies, yet we never get rational gun control laws? You have to combine the power of the monopolies with the campaign the Supreme Court has been on for 40 years to take power away from citizens and vest it in corporations, starting with Buckley v. Citizens, Buckley v. Vallejo through Shelby County. Can you see a way other than a revolution to take this huge concentration of money, power, and politics? Thank you for your book. And as a sort of non-working lawyer, thank you for that question. Zephyr, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so basically it's like, why do you have any hope at all? No, I think it's, so do we need anything short of a revolution? Well, I think we need a political revolution. I mean, so I think the changes need to be pretty severe. This is not tinkering at the margins. And I teach law, and here's a sideways way to answer your story, is that we have gotten so used to treating the court as a heroic institution that makes bad decisions, as opposed to what I think it is, which is a pretty dangerous elite institutions that occasionally makes good decisions. Like we sort of have had periods of a good court, but more often than not, the court has been an incredible tool of corporate power. And John Roberts knows exactly what he's doing when he lines up cases to have like cases that the progressives will like come out the same week that he guts the Voting Rights Act. Anyway, but no, so what are elements of a political revolution? One thing that I do write about that sounds maybe small and legal, but would be epic, is if we can get rid of forced arbitration for workers and consumers, it would just open up our ability to see what's happening in America. Over 50% of employment contracts now, basically people like, the corporate model for getting rid of the civil rights laws of the 60s and 70s was not to overturn the laws. It was to say, yeah, you can have those rights. It's just that you have to go to an arbiter instead of an open court to have those rights realized, which means people don't have those rights realized. But we don't hear all the terrible stories about what is happening in monopolized America because of arbitration. And I think that is one key step in a revolutionary moment. And that just requires a Democratic Senate. I'm not saying the Democratic Senate is easy, but I actually think that's like a key moment of change. People are really mad. We're up against some of the most concentrated, powerful forces in world history because of big data. So we have, like, these are not new ideas. The idea that if you monopolize, you can control, that's an old idea. But the surveillance and the ability of these big companies to treat us all differently and to spy on our politics, that's different. And that's really dangerous and really hard. But we have gotten out of we've had far worse moments in American history. And you don't have to go back more than 50 years to find them. So I do think we can get out of this one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing you mentioned in your book that I've been thinking a lot about is just how long ALEC, which is, one of the early campaigns Color of Change worked on, has been working to like stack the courts that are now generations in and moving up this pipeline. And I would love to see a counter to that through the law schools into the kind of judges we would like to see. But I know we've got a few minutes left, and
yes.
I'm going through these questions. So can you list the books and articles mentioned by the speakers? Thanks. And maybe on our Twitter, perhaps. Zephyr, do you want to remind folks of your Twitter handle?
Oh, Zephyr Teachout. Yes, I'll come back tomorrow. And Brandi, yes.
Yes. Next question. Zephyr makes a good point that we should go to government first. I agree in principle, but could you point to an example where that has worked well? Totally agree that it buys into neoliberalism, but many of the people in office right now are neoliberals. The corporate campaigning helps demonstrate the harm that moves government to action.
So, I think the Stop Hate for Profit is a great example of how that can fit into a dynamic system where that works. I think Zeynep Tufekci is a great writer and critic on this, is showing the way in which we're sort of in a constant flurry of saying that we're going to quit things that we're not necessarily going to quit, and both the ephemeral nature of our activism and also ethical consumer nature of our activism doubly weaken our power. So basically, I think you already agree, but all I can tell you is that when I speak in person or write on social media about one of these big companies, I promise you, people's first response, many people's, not all, people's first response will be, I don't need to use that. I don't need to use Amazon, or just quit Facebook, or use this cool little alternative tool. And I'm just begging you to stop doing that and instead join Athena, which is organizing against Amazon, support Color of Change, which has been organizing against tech for a while. Like, support one of these amazing groups, because you can be so much more powerful than in that isolated atomistic choice to log off for a little bit.
Yeah, it's also a privilege, because like there's a lot of things you can't even apply for jobs sometimes without, engaging with these. Okay, a couple minutes left, going race through. When is Brandi running for office?
Good question. What's the answer?
Not never. Too many skeletons in the closet. And also, I always wanted to be more of the behind the scenes person. If somebody wants to hire me as their strategist, okay. Do you feel that this Amazon/Facebook is a repeat of the practices that we saw with Lehman Brothers, Morgan Stanley, Bear Stearns, no risk management or accountability from corporate boards?
I mean, there's a lot of similarities, and I actually think that you see like the seeds of a lot of younger activism going back to 2008, because basically our institutions totally failed us and acted like nothing had changed and politics hadn't changed after the crash of 2008, when clearly things change. One thing that I think is really important that we should take from the parallel is these big corporate powers are not geniuses. They are not super technocrats who are going to take care of us and have it all figured out. And there's this weird association with success and competence, but they have accumulated power does not mean they cannot break in a major way. And the more we concentrate power, the more fragile that is. And fragility ends up hurting people who depend on it, which is all of us. So fragility is not going to end up hurting Jeff Bezos. But when you have concentrated systems, they're fragile systems. Let's take the socialism question for just a second.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a fun one, and we've got 1 minute left. Okay, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, so somebody wants to ask me, but let's make it a conversation. Now that you're the chief strategist of the calls. So socialists have made the critique of antitrust that approach to private monopoly should not be breaking up, but nationalization, and cite the Nordic model in their defense. So nationalization is on the table, public utility is on the table. Like, I really believe that, so when I say break them up, and this is the danger, it is not that everything should be broken up. It's that there's one thing that is illegitimate, which is concentrated, unregulated private power that isn't a public utility. Like, basically, I think Facebook, Amazon, and Google should be subject to public utility regulation. They are absolutely essential. They should have non-discrimination principles, not get to charge so much, have data they can't collect. Like, this should not be that radical an idea. So it's not in every case breaking up the network. At the same time, though, Amazon still has no business being the marketplace and the warehouses. Like, those can be broken up, and AWS, those can be broken up. So a lot of breakup is about the ways in which companies have leveraged power in one area to gain power in another associated industry, and then build these conflict of interest machines. And there's these two, this is a very crude way of putting it, but there's two anti-monopoly critiques in American history. There's one that's more inflected with socialism from the late 19th century. And then there's one that's more about small businesses from the early 20th century. That's way too simplistic, but whichever you want, we need to break up these companies. And one of the key things that I really want to get across is, if we want Medicare for all, which I strongly think is morally required, we do not want to be negotiated with concentrated medical device industries, concentrated big pharma. Like, we're still, as long as there is private industry, if that private industry is allowed to concentrate, it ends up eating the public part of the project. So we should make sure that we do both. It's not nationalize or decentralize, it's nationalize and decentralize. And I'm very much speaking to DSA in this book. I do not want to nationalize everything, but I do want to nationalize some things. And there's a lot more things that I think should be publicly run at the local level. So it's state run, but local as opposed to state run federal. So what is your nationalization?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I also feel like there's, I don't know, I have questions about how well public utilities here really run, but that's like, you know, regulated, but that's another question for another time because we're over time.
Okay, yes.
But we promise Politics and Prose. Thank you so much for this conversation. I could go on and on with you. I'm so excited. This book is great. Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big AG, Big Tech, and Big Money. Please read. Zephyr, what other book are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh. I am reading, and I brought it because I knew. I'm reading an amazing new book about what we can do with it by Eric, and I know that I'm supposed to bring it, so I'll put it out on my Twitter about our green future. What are you reading, Brandi?
I've got two. I've got Isabel Wilkerson Cast, which just dropped. I'm very excited about. And I had ordered Michael Brooks' Against the Web book like 2 days before he died, and it came after he died, and I'm very excited to read that. So with that,
I'm also reading a book on political theology, which is fascinating, by Aristotle Papanokis. Looking for other language to describe our situation. So anyway, thank you, Brandi. It's so great to have this conversation. Thank you, all of you, for coming.
Politics and Prose. Thank you. Everybody take care.